we would fatally confuse thousands of young girls. I knew that because I knew the literature on psychological contagion. And it stretches back like 500 years, that literature, 300 years. It's all outlined in a book by Henri Ellenberger called History of, what's the name of the book? History of Psychoanalytic Ideas. It doesn't matter. It's Henri Ellenberger and it's his main work if you want to look it up. And so psychological contagions are very common. And so one of them, for example, was the satanic ritual abuse accusations that emerged in daycares in the 1980s. And that was a consequence of women going into the workforce en masse, leaving their children with strangers and starting to have pathological fantasies about it, especially if they were borderline schizophrenic. And those fantasies propagated into the population.
So what does this have to do with creativity? You were talking about creativity in people that are...
Well, okay, so you see people with blue hair, the blue-haired crowd. Well, they're the same people that were doing tattooing and piercing, and they often are literally the same people because they have piercings. It's like, well, they have mutable identities. They're not stable in their identities. They're creative. Creative people, by definition, aren't stable in their identities. That's what makes them creative. Now, the downside of that is creativity is a high-risk, high-return strategy. Your new idea is probably stupid and wrong, and maybe it's fatal. But now and then, it's unbelievably successful. And also, now and then, our culture would die without it. So we always have this problem because we have to maintain stability because otherwise everything degenerates into chaos. But mere stability won't work because the future is different from the past. Like technically different in a non-deterministic way. It's actually different. And so then we have to figure out, well, how do we modify our memories or our traditions at a rate that enables us to keep up with the culture? And the answer to this is, in part, we let creative people play multiple games on the fringe, and some of them are radically successful, and then we copy them.
So you think that a lot of what's going on with people that want to change their gender identity is creativity?
No, I don't think so.
So what do you...
I know so.
You know so.
Yeah, that's not all of it, but that's definitely part of it.
But there are, for sure, a lot of people that transition, and there has been work on this that shows that if they didn't transition, they wanted to transition at one point in time, and then they eventually wound up becoming gay men.
Yeah, that's definitely the case.
Males to females,
yeah, well, it's
right?
confusing. Look, I mean, I also think, by the way, that part of what we're seeing in late adolescence with this insistence on the primacy of felt identity is the reemergence of suppressed fantasy play that should have taken place at between, say, 3 and 5. That's been suppressed by the imposition of technological artifacts like television and phones, and by the absence of free play among children who are hyper-supervised.
So the fantasy play is imperative to develop your identity by trying out a bunch of different patterns of behavior
Yes, exactly.
and ways to be.
Yes, so when my son was about 2, his sister was about 3 and had a little gaggle of friends, and they used to dress him up like a fairy princess. And this didn't happen for like years. It happened for a couple of weeks, and he was playing along. And I went down there, and I'm a Northern Albertan, and so the gender roles there were fairly finely defined. And I was watching this, I thought, is it really a good thing that he's like got wings on, a little fairy hat and a wand and a dress? Is that okay? And I talked to Tammy about it. I said, the girls are dressing Julian up like a princess. And it kind of, I have qualms about it, but I'm not sure what to do because he was having a good time and he was playing with the girls. And
what qualms would you possibly have about that? Because from my personal experience of having daughters,
yeah,
they think it's funny to put me in a dress.
It is funny.
Yeah. Well, there was a dress that my wife was throwing out, and my daughters made me put it on. They forced me to, and they took pictures of me.
Yeah, I bet
they thought it was hilarious.
Yeah. My daughter decorated me up like a woman one day in her makeup class.
Right. So what's wrong with that? Nothing, right?
Well, that's
just fun.
No. Well, that's it. That's what I concluded. I thought, well,
but why would you worry about anything else other than it being fun?
Well, probably because why was I worried about it? I suppose because I hoped that his pathway towards adulthood would be
Normal?
yeah, sure.
Normal biological male progression to
Yeah. And so I saw
marriage
this
and
playing,
children,
but then I
yeah.
thought, I only had qualms for like about 2 hours. I went and thought about it. I thought, okay, what's going on here? Well, he's playing with the girls. Okay, should he play with girls? Yes, definitely. He should play with girls. Absolutely. Adult males should play with women. Like, we should be able to play with people of the opposite sex. Like, so he's learning to play with the girls. Good. Is he enjoying it? Yes. Are they bullying him? No. Are the girls enjoying it? Yes. That's all good. Okay, so what does it mean he's playing at being a girl? Oh, he's trying to understand what it means to be a girl. Well, how do you understand that when you're 3 or maybe when you're 50? You play at it, which means you allow that pattern of being to inhabit you and you experiment with it. Now, a lot of older transgender types, the late onset types, they're playing. They just don't know it. Now, there are often people who have a kind of a rigid identity, and part of their escape from that rigid identity is to develop some of the characteristics that are typical of the opposite sex. They need it.
What is the term? There is a term for a man who derives a lot of sexual pleasure. He's heterosexual, but he
I
derives
think it's
sexual...
autogynephilia.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah, but I think the sexual...
fully explain that.
Yeah, well, I don't think it does. I think the reason they derive... Because the question is, why do they derive sexual pleasure?
Finish the sentence. You're not finishing the sentence. Like, explain what we're saying.
Yeah, well, they derive sexual pleasure. They get turned on by seeing themselves in the clothes of women.
Yes.
Or feeling it.
Yes.
But I think the sexual instinct is directing them towards personality expansion. I look at it in Jungian terms. So part of the process of personality expansion in the deep psychoanalytic sense is first you're a persona. Or first you're nothing. Then you develop a persona, which is a way of presenting yourself in a socially acceptable way to the world. And maybe you confuse yourself with your persona. Now, you've had conversations with people on your podcast who are stiff and you can't get a dynamic conversation going. And it's because they're acting out their persona. You're not really talking to them. You're talking to an act that they've constructed. It's a puppet. An act that they've constructed to make themselves socially acceptable to the world.
And sometimes it's just anxiety.
Yeah, sure. It can be anxiety too. But then often under anxious conditions, people will revert to their persona because it's a well-rehearsed set of routines and that they know is socially acceptable. Okay, so for the Jungians, the